The declaration was made on a Wednesday. Not because Wednesday was significant, not because the Galactic Remembrance Council had chosen it with any particular intention, but because the paperwork had been finalized on a Tuesday, and the Council's administrative protocol required a 24-hour review period before any species could be formally entered into the Registry of the Extinct. So it was a Wednesday. The session opened at the standard hour. 412 Council representatives were present in the chamber. Another 987 attended by remote link across 31 star systems. The agenda had been circulated the previous week. Item 7, and this is the item that matters, read simply: formal registration, species Homo sapiens, designation human, status extinct, pending confirmation. It was item 7 of 14. The items before it had been routine: a boundary dispute in the 7th reach, a trade reclassification for the Monathi Cooperative, an infrastructure grant for 3 developing worlds in the outer spiral. These had been discussed, amended, voted upon, and recorded. Then item 7. The presiding officer, Senior Archivist Thalveson, read the declaration in the standard format. The words were the same words that had been used 41 times before in the Council's history. The Registry of the Extinct contained 41 entries. Each entry had been read into the record in this same chamber, by a presiding officer reading from the same template in the same measured tone that the protocol required. The tone was designed to be neutral. Not cold, not ceremonial, but neutral, the tone of a fact being recorded rather than a loss being mourned. The Council had learned over centuries of administering these declarations that neutral was the most honest register. Some of the 41 entries had been mourned, some had not. Neutral was the tone that fit all of them without forcing anything false. Archivist Thalveson read the declaration. The chamber was quiet. The declaration was, by the standards of the registry, straightforward. The species designated Homo sapiens, commonly called humans, native to the 3rd planet of a yellow star in the outer spiral arm of the galaxy, had been confirmed absent from all known inhabited space for a period of 63 years. No human vessel had been recorded in any port. No human communication had been received by any relay station. No human biological signature had been detected by any survey team in the 6 decades since the last confirmed human contact. The standard threshold for extinction registration was 50 years of confirmed absence. Humans had exceeded that threshold by 13 years. The delay, Archivist Vesson noted for the record, was not procedural failure. It was, she said, the result of something more unusual. Several council members had, over the preceding 6 decades, repeatedly requested extensions of the review period. They had done so without explaining their reasons in formal terms. When asked, they had offered variations of the same answer. They said they were not ready to stop looking. The Council had allowed the extensions because the Council, whatever its procedural rigidities, was composed of people. And people, whatever their species, understood the particular difficulty of writing a final entry. But 63 years had passed. The extensions had been exhausted. The threshold had been exceeded by 13 years. And on a Wednesday, with 412 members present and 987 attending by remote link, the declaration was read. Homo sapiens extinct. The vote to confirm was 401 in favor, 9 abstentions, 2 against. The 2 votes against were cast by the Monathi delegation and the Keth representatives. Neither delegation offered a formal explanation for their dissent. Neither was required to. The record shows only their votes. The record does not show what they knew. What the record also does not show is what happened in the corridors outside the chamber in the minutes after the session ended. Senior Archivist Thalveson, who had read the declaration, sat for several minutes at the presiding officer's bench after the chamber had emptied. She had been an archivist for 30 years. She had processed thousands of registrations, tens of thousands of administrative acts, the entire accumulated paperwork of galactic civilization moving through its bureaucratic routines. She was not a sentimental person. Sentiment was not useful in archival work. What was useful was precision, and she had precision. She sat at the bench for 11 minutes. The timing is in the record because the session logging system does not stop until the presiding officer formally closes the log, and she did not close it for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes she sat with the declaration she had just read, not reviewing it, not reconsidering it, simp. Lie sitting with the weight of having said the words aloud in the chamber, of having made them official, of having written the 42nd entry in the Registry of the Extinct in her own voice. 42 entries, she had written 3 of them personally, the others she had witnessed. None of them had felt like this one. She could not have said why precisely. The humans met the threshold, the evidence was clear. The procedure had been followed correctly. There was no professional reason for what she was feeling, which was less like the completion of a task and more like the closing of a door in a house that was not empty. She closed the log. She filed the entry. She went home. She did not sleep well that Wednesday night. She did not record this anywhere. But it is the kind of thing that is true whether it is recorded or not, and the record that I am assembling here is intended to capture what was true as well as what was written down. It had not been planned. The Council's protocol for extinction registration did not include a eulogy. The declaration was a legal and administrative act. The registry entry was a factual record. There was no provision in the standard procedure for anything resembling a memorial. But after the vote was confirmed, after the clerk had entered the registration and the presiding officer had moved to announce item 8, a representative rose from her seat without requesting the floor. Her name was Elder Amaranth of the Silvari Communion. She had been a council representative for 31 years. She was 84 years old. She had in her 31 years spoken from the floor without request exactly twice before, and both times the chamber had fallen silent and listened because Elder Amaranth did not speak without reason, and people who did not speak without reason were worth hearing when they chose to speak. As she stood, the presiding officer paused. The chamber waited. Elder Amaranth said in a voice that was quiet but carried, "I would like to speak about the humans. Not about the registration, about the humans. I would like, if the chamber permits, to say what they were." The presiding officer looked at the chamber did not object, she nodded. And Elder Amaranth spoke. She spoke for 40 minutes. What follows is a reconstruction, drawn from the official session transcript of what she said. The transcript is accurate but flat, it captures the words and not the weight of them. I offer it here as faithfully as I can, knowing that the full truth of it lived in the room that day and cannot be entirely recovered. She said, "I knew humans, not as a diplomatic category, not as a species entry in a council database. I knew specific humans individually across 30 years of this work, and I want to tell you what they were like." She said they were, as a species, constitutionally unable to walk past a problem without addressing it. This was not a policy, it was not a strategy, it was simply how they were built. You could put a human in a room with 1,000 things working correctly and one thing working incorrectly, and they would find the incorrect thing within minutes, not because they were looking for it, because the incorrect thing called to them in some way that the correct things did not. And then, having found it, they would fix it. Not always well, not always quickly, but they would fix it and they would not consider the fixing remarkable and they would move on. She said, "I worked with a human once on the Keth Water Reclamation Project, 40 years ago. The project was a technical disaster. 3 different engineering firms had attempted it and abandoned it. The contamination was in the subsoil at a depth that the standard approaches could not reach economically. The Keth people were managing, but managing in the way that people manage when they have been living with a problem for so long that they have stopped believing it can be solved. They had accepted it. The problem had become part of their lives. The human, whose name was Dr. Sierra Vance, arrived with a small team and a supply of equipment that the other firms had not used because it was technically obsolete. She had chosen it specifically because of its obsolescence, because obsolete equipment had been designed for conditions that modern equipment had been designed to improve upon, and the conditions in the Keth subsoil were, she had determined, more similar to the old conditions than the new ones. She fixed it in 8 months. The Keth people had been managing for 40 years. She fixed it in 8 months with obsolete equipment and a team of 6. When I asked her afterward how she had known to use the old approach, she said something I have thought about every year since. She said, "The problem didn't care what year it was. I matched the tool to the problem, not to the calendar." She said, "Humans had a specific relationship with time that I have not observed in any other species. As to the same degree, they understood in a very deep way that problems do not age, that a thing which was broken yesterday is still broken today, and that the amount of time it has been broken is not a reason to accept it but a measure of how long the fix has been owed. They did not look at a 40-year-old problem and see intractability. They looked at it and saw a 40-year debt." She said, "I want to tell you something that is not in any council record. 12 years ago, a small Silvari colony in the Outer Reach had a medical emergency. A respiratory illness fast-moving, the kind that spreads through air filtration systems in closed habitats before anyone understands what is happening. We had 93 people in that colony. Within 2 weeks, 61 of them were ill. Our nearest medical facility was 4 days away. I sent a distress signal. I received responses from 3 parties within 18 hours. The first was the Council's Emergency Medical Division, which acknowledged the signal, expressed concern, and estimated a response window of 6 to 9 days pending resource allocation. The second was a commercial pharmaceutical relay, which offered to expedite a supply shipment of general antivirals for a cost that, I note, was approximately 3 times the standard price. The colony's situation had been flagged as urgent, and the pricing reflected this. The third response was from a human medical ship, the EDS Callaway, which was not in the emergency response system, which had no treaty obligation to respond, which was in the area because it was conducting routine survey work in the outer reach. Its captain, a woman named Dr. Yusra Osman, had seen the signal while it was passing through the relay. She wrote, and I have kept this message for 12 years, she wrote, "We are 18 hours from your position. We have a full medical team and antivirals, and I have a researcher aboard who has worked with respiratory illness outbreaks. We are coming. Please send me everything you have on the pathogen." She arrived in 19 hours. 19 hours, 1 hour over her estimate. She apologized for the delay. The delay was a navigation correction around an asteroid field. She apologized. She and her team worked for 11 days. 61 sick, 3 died before she arrived, 58 recovered. When she left, she filed a formal report with the Council's medical division documenting the pathogen, the treatment protocol, and 6 recommendations for improving early detection in closed habitat environments. She charged us nothing. When I asked her why she had come when she had no obligation, why she had charged nothing, why she had spent 11 days on a colony that had no connection to her, she said the thing that I have since understood is the closest thing to a human explanation of themselves. She said, "Someone needed help. I had help to give. The math wasn't complicated." The math wasn't complicated. She said, "I want to tell you what it means that they are gone, not the infrastructure, not the navigation beacons and the medical research and the emergency response logistics and the scientific collaborations. Those things matter and their absence will be felt. But I want to tell you what it means in the other sense. The galaxy has lost a specific kind of attention, the kind that notices the wobbling table, the kind that sees the 40-year-old problem and feels the debt, the kind that receives a distress signal with no obligation and does the math and finds it uncomplicated. That attention is not replaceable by committee. It is not something that can be allocated by policy. It was a way of being in the world that a specific people had developed over a very long time and brought with them everywhere they went, and when they were gone, it went with them. I grieve that. I grieve it today in this chamber formally on the record, because I believe it deserves to be on the record. I am not ready to stop looking for them. But I accept that we must write the entry. She sat down. The chamber was silent for 43 seconds. The transcript notes this because the timing systems continue recording even when no one is speaking, and the 43 seconds are there in the record, a silence too long to be transitional, exactly as long as the kind of silence that follows something that needed to be said and has been said. Then the presiding officer announced item 8. For the record, and this record is intended to outlast the crisis, to be read by whoever comes after and needs to understand what happened and why, I want to supplement Elder Amaranth's account with the fuller picture. Because Elder Amaranth spoke from her experience. Her experience was true, but experience is personal and the full shape of what the humans were requires more than any one person's account. I have spent 40 years in the Council's archival division. I have read more documents about humans than I have read out any other species, including my own. What follows is what the documents show. Humans arrived in galactic contact late. By the standards of the civilizations that made up the Council, they were young not in their technology, which had developed rapidly, but in their presence. They had been aware of the galaxy for approximately 200 years before they became active participants in it. In those 200 years, they had watched and studied and prepared in ways that were visible only in retrospect. When they arrived knowing how things worked, not perfectly, not without making errors of judgment and culture and expectation. But they had done their research in a way that most newly contacting species did not, because most newly contacting species were focused on what the galaxy could offer them, and the humans had arrived focused on a different question. What can we offer? This orientation produced results within the first decades of their Council membership that were, looking back, remarkable in their consistency. They did not specialize. That is the first and most important thing to understand. Every other Council member civilization had a primary contribution, the Velhari in navigation science, the Keth in agricultural biotechnology, the Solvari in diplomatic mediation. The humans had primary contributions in everything. Not always the leading contribution, not always the most sophisticated, but present everywhere in every field with a quality of engagement that was distinctive. The quality was this: they treated every problem as if it were their problem. Not metaphorically, not as a diplomatic gesture, as a practical reality. A human researcher working on a joint project with the Monathi on respiratory illness was not working on a Monathi problem. She was working on a problem that existed that she had the tools to address and that therefore fell within what she understood to be her responsibility. The Monathi affiliation was incidental. The problem was the thing. This produced friction sometimes. Some council members found it presumptuous. The humans were working on our problems without being asked. They were offering solutions that had not been requested. They were showing up at disasters with equipment before the affected parties had formally requested assistance. The friction was real. The humans, to their credit, acknowledged it. They attempted to calibrate to work within formal request structures to wait for the invitation before arriving. They were not entirely successful at this. The instinct was too deep. You could put a human in a situation where someone needed help and tell them to wait for the proper paperwork and they would wait, but you could see it cost them something. The waiting sat wrong in them. It was not in their nature to see a need and stand at a distance from it because the forms had not been processed. What the council had not fully appreciated, until it was too late to appreciate it differently, was that this instinct was not a cultural preference or a diplomatic strategy. It was the thing itself. It was what the humans were. And what the humans were had built over 2 centuries of showing up and fixing things and not sending invoices and not waiting for the paperwork, an infrastructure of relationship that was invisible precisely because it was so consistent. Invisible things are not noticed until they are absent. The humans became absent and the council noticed. But I am getting ahead of the records. What I want to establish here before we come to the ships is the specific texture of what was lost. Not the quantity of it, the audit figures for that are elsewhere and are staggering, but the texture. A human doctor working in a remote Keth community. She has been there for 3 years on a volunteer placement. She is not employed by the council. She is not fulfilling a treaty obligation. She is there because there was a shortage and she heard about it and she went. In 3 years, she has treated 1,400 patients. She has trained 7 local health workers who will continue the work after she leaves. She has submitted 3 research papers on local pathogens that did not previously appear in any galactic medical database. She has fixed the water filtration system in the clinic twice because it kept developing the same fault, and she finally diagnosed the root cause and corrected it. She has on 4 occasions driven a ground vehicle for 6 hours each way to reach patients in outlying settlements because they could not come to the clinic, and she was not prepared to let them not be reached. When she leaves, none of this appears in any official record except the research papers. The 1,400 patients are not counted, the 7 trained health workers are not attributed to her, the water filtration fix is not documented, the 6-hour drives are not on any log. She does not consider this a problem she was not doing it for the record. Multiply this by 2 centuries, and by hundreds of thousands of individual humans operating in the same register across every inhabited system in council space. Multiply it by the engineers who stayed late, the researchers who shared data freely, the emergency teams who came before they were called, the diplomats who found solutions that made both sides feel they had won, the teachers and doctors and builders and scientists who were simply present reliably in every place that needed presence. That is what was lost on the Wednesday the declaration was read. That is what Elder Amaranth was mourning in the chamber. That is what the record must preserve. The eulogy was still being read. Elder Amaranth had been speaking for 22 minutes. She was in the section about Dr. Yusra Osman and the Solvari colony, the part about the math not being complicated, when the alert came through. It came first to the Navigation Division, which received it as an anomaly report from the Outer Reach Relay Network, a cluster of beacon signals that did not match any registered vessel class. The relay system flagged it as unusual but not emergency, which meant it was entered into the standard monitoring queue rather than triggering an immediate alert. It sat in the queue for 4 minutes while Elder Amaranth spoke. Then the secondary analysis system processed it and upgraded the flag. Because the vessel signatures were not unregistered, they were registered. They were registered to a class that had not been active in 63 years. A class that appeared in the Council's records under a designation that the system had to access from a historical archive because the designation had been moved from the active registry to the inactive registry 40 years ago. The designation was Human Vessel Deep Survey Class. Not 1 signal, not 2. The relay network was picking up 47 distinct signatures. 47 human vessels, emerging from an outer reach navigation corridor that had been marked as low priority and rarely swept. The Navigation Division sent the alert to the session chamber. Standard protocol for navigation anomalies during council sessions was to route alerts to the presiding officer's secondary screen, which she would review at the conclusion of the current agenda item. The presiding officer saw the alert appear on her screen. She looked at it. She read it again. She did not wait for the conclusion of the current agenda item. She stood. Elder Amaranth stopped speaking. The presiding officer said, with the specific quality of control that people use when they need to say something enormous in a way that the room can receive it without breaking apart, she said, "I need to interrupt the proceedings. I have received a navigation alert. I am going to read it to the chamber." She read it. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then it was not silent. The noise was not panic. It was not celebration, not yet, because 63 years had passed and 2 votes had been cast against the registration, and the alert was real, and the ships were real, but the people who had been sitting with 63 years of absence needed a moment longer than this to understand that the absence was ending. The noise was the sound of people trying to process something that was too large and too sudden and too long-awaited to fit into the ordinary categories of response. Elder Amaranth sat back down. The transcript notes that she sat down with a particular quality, not collapsing, not overwhelmed, but with the specific physical quality of someone whose body has made a decision before their mind has finished processing. She sat down the way people sit down when they realize they have been standing against a weight that is no longer there. In the record, her microphone was still open. The transcript preserves 3 words she said, quietly, not as a statement to the chamber, but as a thing said to herself in the moment of understanding. She said, "I knew it." The ships arrived at Council space 4 days later. 47 vessels, deep survey class as the relay had identified. The class had been designed for long-range independent operation 6 months a year longer if the mission required. They were large ships, not warships, not colony ships. Survey ships, which meant they carried laboratories and medical facilities and manufacturing equipment, and everything a crew would need to operate at the edge of known space for an extended period without resupply. They had been operating for 63 years. The lead vessel was called the ADS Perseverance. Its captain was a woman named Admiral Dr. Rin Vasquez. She was 81 years old. She had been 18 when the fleet had departed, which meant she had spent 63 years, the entirety of her adult life, in the deep survey corridor. She had been born on Earth. She had last seen it at 18. She was, by any reasonable accounting, a person who had given everything she had to a mission that the galaxy had assumed no longer existed. The communication she sent ahead of the fleet's arrival was brief. It was not a demand. It was not a complaint. It contained no reference to the registration or the declaration or the eulogy that had been, by that point, transmitted galaxy-wide by approximately 40 news services. It said, "This is Admiral Rin Vasquez of the EDS Perseverance, leading Survey Fleet 7. We have been conducting deep survey operations in the Outer Reach Corridor for 63 years. We have a great deal of data to share. We are low on certain supplies and would appreciate resupply at the earliest opportunity. We look forward to seeing everyone. It has been a long time." It has been a long time. The Council's response team spent 3 days preparing for the fleet's arrival. The preparation was by all accounts somewhat frantic, not because the logistics were difficult, but because the people doing the preparation kept stopping to deal with the particular weight of what they were doing. They were preparing for the arrival of people who had been declared extinct 4 days ago. They were preparing for the return of something the galaxy had written a eulogy for while it was still happening. When the fleet arrived at the Council's primary station and the docking began and the airlocks opened, the reception committee was waiting. Admiral Vasquez walked through the airlock first. She was small, 81 years old, the particular leanness of someone who has spent decades on deep space rations and station recycled air. Her hair was entirely white. She walked with the unhurried gait of someone who has learned over a very long time that the pace of arrival is less important than the fact of it. She looked around the docking bay. She saw the reception committee, the banners, the assembled crowd that had gathered because word had spread, and people had come from 3 adjacent stations because they wanted to witness this. She said to no one in particular, "You've redecorated." The translation came a beat later. The reception committee laughed. The laugh broke something in the room that had needed to be broken. Then Senior Liaison Director Kameth, who had been designated to give the official welcome, stepped forward. He had prepared remarks, extensive remarks, remarks that had been reviewed by 3 separate committees and revised 7 times and were, by every standard of Council protocol, appropriate and thorough. He looked at Admiral Vasquez. He put the prepared remarks in his pocket. He said, "We declared you extinct." She looked at him. Her expression was the expression of someone who has heard a surprising thing and is deciding how to respond to it. "We heard," she said, "4 days ago someone picked up the transmission." A pause. "We thought it was a bit premature." Equals. Part 5. What they had been doing. Equals. The debrief took 3 months. Not because the information was difficult to transfer. The fleet's data archives were comprehensive and well-organized, 63 years of survey records filed with the systematic precision of people who had a great deal of time and no bureaucracy to slow them down. The transfer itself took 11 days. The debrief took 3 months because the people receiving the information needed time between sessions to process what they were receiving. Survey Fleet 7 had not simply been conducting passive observation. They had been working. Admiral Vasquez, in the first formal session, laid out what the fleet had done in 63 years in the Outer Reach Corridor, with the specific efficiency of someone who has been organizing the same information in her head for a very long time and knows exactly how to present it. The Outer Reach Corridor had not been empty. The Council's navigational charts marked it as low priority, and low priority had meant in practice unmonitored. Survey Fleet 7 had discovered that unmonitored did not mean uninhabited. It meant inhabited by civilizations that no one had gotten around to visiting yet. In 63 years, the fleet had made first contact with 22 species. 22. The Council's entire history of first contacts across all of known space numbered 114. Survey Fleet 7 had, in 63 years of operation in one corridor, added 19% to that total. But the number was not the thing was what had happened after the contacts. The fleet had not cataloged and moved on, they had stayed. They had learned languages, built relationships, offered assistance where assistance was needed and accepted, established communication protocols that had allowed 22 civilizations that had been operating in isolation to begin reaching outward. 11. Of the 22 had, by the time the fleet departed, made contact with neighboring species. 7 had established trade relationships. 3 had resolved conflicts that had been running for generations, because a third party had arrived that both sides trusted and was willing to sit in the middle and work through it. None of this was in the fleet's mission parameters. The mission parameters had specified survey and cataloging. The fleet had surveyed and cataloged. They had also apparently been unable to stop themselves from doing more than the parameters specified. When Director Kamath asked Admiral Vasquez about this, gently, carefully, trying to understand the decision-making process, she gave an answer that has since become one of the most cited pieces of human testimony in the Council's archive. She said, "We had the tools, they had the needs. The mission parameters were written before we knew what we would find. When we found more than the parameters anticipated, we did more than the parameters specified. That seemed right. When we found more than the parameters anticipated, we did more than the parameters specified." The Council's legal division spent 2 weeks discussing whether Survey Fleet 7 had exceeded their authorization. The discussion was resolved when Director Kamath pointed out that the fleet had been operating under a mandate from an entity that had declared them extinct, and the legal standing of a mandate from an entity that believed you were dead was, he suggested, sufficiently unclear that perhaps the legal question was not the most productive place to direct the Council's attention. The legal division agreed, somewhat reluctantly. The debrief continued. The medical data alone required 6 weeks to transfer and review. 63 years of research in an isolated corridor had produced findings on pathogens and treatments and environmental health factors that appeared nowhere in the Council's existing medical databases. 27 of the findings were, in the assessment of the Council's chief medical analyst, of immediate practical significance, meaning they addressed conditions that were currently affecting populations in Council space. The research had been conducted not by dedicated researchers but by the fleet's medical staff, who had done it in addition to their primary duties, because the conditions they were encountering were new and needed to be understood, and they were the people present who had the skills to understand them. The navigation data was equally significant. 63 years of survey work in an uncharted corridor had produced charts of sufficient precision to open 17 new transit routes. The Outer Reach Corridor, which had been low priority precisely because it was uncharted, would cease to be low priority the moment the charts were published. It would become one of the most important routes in the galaxy's eastern reach. The fleet had mapped it completely. Every star, every hazard, every gravitational feature that a vessel would need to know about. The charts were annotated in the specific way that human charts were always annotated, with notes about conditions and cautions and points of interest that exceeded what was strictly necessary, because the people who made them had thought about who would use them and what those people would need to know. Toward the end of the debrief, Director Kamath asked Admiral Vasquez a question that had been on his mind since the first session. He had waited because he was not sure how to ask it without it sounding like an accusation, and he did not want it to sound like an accusation. He wanted it to sound like what it was, which was genuine incomprehension. He said, "The signal degradation in that corridor, we know it was significant. We know your communications with Council space were affected. We know there were periods, years, we believe, when you could not have reached us even if you had tried. She nodded. Did you try, he said. She looked at him steadily. Yes, in the first decade, regularly. After that, less regularly because we understood the technical limitation and because the work was there and we did the work. But yes, we tried. And when you couldn't reach us? We kept working, she said. The corridor didn't care whether we could reach you. The people in the corridor didn't care. The work was there. A pause. We knew you would either come to find us eventually or we would eventually find a way to reach you. In the meantime, there was work to do, so we did it. Equals. Part 6, The Reckoning. Equals. The session in which the registry entry was formally removed was not, by the standards of council proceedings, a dramatic one. The paperwork was straightforward. The entry had been made in error, the species in question had not been extinct, and the protocol for erroneous entries was well established. The entry was struck. A formal correction was entered. The clerk recorded the correction with the same neutral efficiency with which he had recorded the original declaration. The vote to confirm was unanimous. But before the vote, Director Kamath was given the floor. He had prepared remarks again. This time he delivered them. He said, I want to speak to what we have learned, not administratively but as a community. He said, we declared a people extinct because they had been absent from our records for 63 years. We were not wrong to follow our procedures. 63 years of confirmed absence is not a thing to dismiss. The threshold exists for a reason, and we applied it correctly. But I want us to sit with the specific nature of our error. We assumed that absence from our records was the same as absence from the galaxy. We assumed that the boundary of what we could see was the boundary of what existed. Survey Fleet 7 did not disappear. They went further out than our systems could follow, and they kept working. They found 22 civilizations we did not know existed. They opened 17 transit routes we did not know were possible. They treated patients and mapped corridors and sat between parties in conflict and worked through the nights and kept their files in order and sent signals home when they could and kept working when they could not. For 63 years. We wrote the eulogies. They were in the middle of the works. He paused. He said, I do not think this says something about our procedures. Our procedures were sound. I think it says something about humans. About the specific quality of their attention and their commitment and their refusal to stop because the circumstances had become difficult or because the communications had degraded or because no one was watching or because the parameters had been exceeded. They do not stop, not when it is hard, not when it is unrewarded, not when the galaxy has decided with the appropriate paperwork that they no longer exist. They keep working. We should be grateful for this. We should be more than grateful. We should be changed by it. We should understand, having watched what they did in that corridor for 63 years, that what they are is something that cannot be replicated by policy or mandated by treaty or substituted by any other means we have available. We should look at what they did and ask what it requires of us now. Not as a debt, they would not accept it framed as a debt, but as a standard, a thing to aim for. The question of what we owe them is less important than the question of what they have shown us we could be. He sat down. The vote was taken. The entry was struck. And after the session, in the corridor outside the chamber, Elder Amaranth of the Silvari Communion found Admiral Rin Vasquez standing by a viewport looking out at the station's transit lanes. Watching ships move through space with the particular quality of attention that an 81-year-old woman who has spent 63 years in deep survey corridors brings to the sight of a busy port. Elder Amaranth stood beside her. They watched together for a while. Then Elder Amaranth said, I gave you a eulogy. Admiral Vasquez said, I heard, it was very kind. I said things I meant. I know, said Vasquez. We listened to the whole transmission, all 47 ships. We gathered in the main observation bay of the Perseverance and we listened to the whole thing. A pause. It was the first transmission we had received in 11 years. The corridor communications had been completely degraded for 11 years. And the first thing we heard was your voice telling the council what humans were like. Elder Amaranth was quiet for a moment. What did you think? Admiral Vasquez was quiet too, watching the transit lanes. I thought you had it mostly right, she said. The part about the math not being complicated, that's accurate, that's how it feels from the inside. She paused. I thought the chamber deserved to hear it, even if we weren't gone, even if the whole thing was premature. It was given in good faith, said Amaranth. I know, said Vasquez, the best things usually are. They stood there a while longer, two old women at a viewport, one who had given a eulogy, one who had been its subject and had heard it from 11 years of silence and had kept working anyway. After a while, Admiral Vasquez said quietly, "Thank you for the part about Yusra Osman. She deserved to be remembered. She was good." "She was," said Amaranth. "She would have hated the eulogy format," said Vasquez. "She would have said you should have spent the time doing something useful." Amaranth smiled. It was the smile of someone who has understood something they already knew. "Yes," she said, "that does sound like her." Equals equals equals. Call to action. Equals equals equals. Equals equals equals. That is the story. A declaration, a eulogy, a silence of 43 seconds, and then 47 ships emerging from a corridor that no one had been watching, full of people who had kept working for 63 years because the work was there and they were the people present, and the math, as always, was not complicated. I want to leave you with something that is not in the official record. In the months after the fleet's return, the Council established a formal liaison program with Survey Fleet 7, a process for integrating 63 years of data and relationship building into the Council's existing systems. It was important work, necessary work. Admiral Vasquez participated in it fully. She attended every session. She answered every question. She delivered every data set on time and organized and annotated with the same precision that characterized everything the fleet had produced. And then, 8 months after the return, she filed a request. She requested authorization for Survey Fleet 7 to return to the Outer Reach Corridor. Not all 47 ships. She specified 22, the ones that had the deepest established relationships with the newly contacted civilizations, the ones whose presence in those communities would be most useful. She wrote that there were ongoing situations in several systems that she was reluctant to leave unresolved. She wrote that the transit routes they had opened would benefit from continued maintenance and monitoring. She wrote that there were signals in the deeper corridor that the fleet had not had time to fully investigate, and that she had reason to believe they indicated the presence of additional civilizations. She wrote in the final paragraph of the request, "We understand if the Council wishes us to remain in monitored space. We are prepared to accept that assignment if it is what is needed, but if there is freedom to continue the work, we would prefer to continue the work. That is what we are for." The Council approved the request. 22 ships returned to the Outer Reach Corridor. They are there now. The communications are better this time. The relay network was upgraded as part of the post-survey data integration program. The ships send regular reports. The reports are detailed and organized and annotated in the way that human reports always are. They are not waiting for instructions. They are not filling out forms or waiting for authorizations or sitting at the boundary of the corridor, waiting for someone to tell them what the parameters require. They are workings. They will keep workings. That is what they are for. And when the day comes, as it will come, when one of those ships makes contact with a new civilization, and a young crew member asks the captain what to do, how to proceed, whether to stay or to go, whether to help or to catalog and move on, the captain will give the same answer that Admiral Vasquez would give, the same answer that Dr. Yusra Osman would give, the same answer that every human who has ever gone to a far place with tools and the willingness to use them has understood in their bones. You look at what is needed. You look at what you have. You do the maths. The math is not complicated. You stay. You work. This channel is for the people who already know this. The ones who have been doing the math their whole lives and finding it uncomplicated. The ones who go further than the parameters require because the need exceeded the parameters and the need was the thing that mattered. You know who you are. You are still in the corridor. Keep working. If this story found you today, if you recognize something in it, the 63 years of quiet work, the signal sent into silence, the eulogy that was premature, subscribe. Every week we bring the stories of the people who stay in the corridor when everyone else has left. Leave a comment, tell me about your corridor, the place you have kept working when no one was watching, when the communications were down, when the paperwork said you were finished. Tell me about the math that wasn't complicated. Share this with someone who is still in their corridor.